Colonel David Carter stepped into the bustling airport terminal, his polished dress shoes clicking against the tile floor. The familiar scent of coffee and the hum of rolling suitcases filled the air, but today, none of it registered. His mind was elsewhere, weighed down by the solemn responsibility he carried. Beneath the ribbons and medals on his crisp uniform lay a burden far heavier, the duty of escorting a fallen soldier home. Private First Class Jason Reynolds was just 21. Too young, too much life left unlived, and now his body rested in a flag-draped casket waiting on the tarmac, a silent testament to sacrifice. Carter had escorted soldiers before, but it never got easier. It wasn't just another mission, it was a promise, a vow that no soldier would be forgotten, that their journey home would be one of dignity and honor. The terminal pulsed with its usual chaos. Families huddled near departure gates, business travelers tapped furiously on their phones, and announcements crackled over the intercom. Most people were wrapped in their own world, oblivious to the weight Carter carried. He had grown accustomed to it. The life of a soldier was often unseen, their sacrifices acknowledged only in fleeting moments before the world moved on. He approached the airline counter, setting down his military orders and ID. The agent, a young woman with a rehearsed customer service smile, glanced at the documents before typing into her computer. Her fingers hesitated. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. Then something else, something Carter had seen before but never got used to. Her smile faltered. She turned to whisper something to a colleague. The pause stretched longer than it should have. Carter straightened, his years of discipline keeping his expression neutral. He had faced battlefields, negotiations, and high-stakes situations. But here, in an airport terminal, he was met with hesitation, a subtle, familiar resistance that had nothing to do with policies and everything to do with something unspoken. The agent returned, her voice tight. "I'm sorry, sir, but there seems to be an issue with your ticket. We can't allow you to board at this time." Carter exhaled slowly. His patience had been tested in many ways throughout his career. But this was different. "I'm escorting the remains of a fallen soldier," he said evenly, tapping the official paperwork. "Everything is in order." She avoided his gaze. "I understand, sir, but we have certain protocols, and we can't override them." A murmur rose from the passengers in line behind him, sensing the tension. Carter squared his shoulders. He had fought for his country. He had buried friends. And now, here he was, standing in an airport, being told that his mission, the final duty to a young soldier who had given everything, was suddenly a matter of inconvenience. And he wasn't going anywhere without an answer. Colonel David Carter remained still, his fingers resting on the edge of the counter as he processed the words that had just been spoken to him. The weight in his chest had nothing to do with the medals pinned to his uniform, but with the absurdity of the situation. He had faced combat, coordinated missions under fire, and negotiated with foreign officials. Yet here he was, being denied a seat on a commercial flight for reasons no one seemed willing to clarify. The young airline agent behind the counter shifted uneasily, avoiding eye contact as she repeated herself. "I'm sorry, sir, but there's an issue with your ticket. You won't be able to board this flight." Carter inhaled deeply, keeping his voice steady. "This is a military assignment. I am escorting the remains of Private First Class Jason Reynolds home. My documents are in order." She glanced toward her supervisor, who had been standing nearby, pretending not to listen. The man, in his mid-50s with a tired expression, adjusted his name tag and stepped forward, folding his arms as he assessed Carter with the same vague discomfort. "Sir, I understand your situation," he said, his tone carefully controlled. "But there are certain policies we have to follow, and unfortunately, we can't override them at this time." Policies. That word again. It was the kind of answer given when someone didn't want to explain the real reason behind their decision. Carter straightened. "Which policies exactly?" The supervisor hesitated, his jaw tightening slightly. "It's a security measure, sir." Carter's patience was being tested. "Security measure?" His voice remained calm, but the steel behind it was unmistakable. "I've been on military flights, commercial flights, and diplomatic transports. I know the procedures, and I know there's no security policy preventing a uniformed officer from escorting a fallen soldier." The murmurs from the passengers behind him grew louder. Travelers who had been minding their own business were now paying attention, sensing that something wasn't right. A few exchanged glances, whispering to one another. A woman in a red blazer frowned as she listened, nudging her husband. The supervisor cleared his throat. "Sir, this isn't personal. We're just following protocol." Carter studied the man's face, the stiffness of his posture, the way his eyes flicked toward the growing crowd. He had seen this before. It wasn't about security. It was about something else, something unspoken but understood. And they were hoping he would quietly accept it and walk away. But that wasn't going to happen. From behind him, a deep voice broke the tension. "Sir, do you have an issue with his military clearance?" Carter turned slightly, spotting an older man in line a few feet away. His weathered face bore the years of service, and the USMC hat pulled low over his brow left no doubt about his background. A Marine, a veteran. The supervisor stiffened. "No, sir, this isn't about clearance." The Marine folded his arms. "Then what's it about?" "Because I've been through a lot of security checks, and I've never seen protocol stop a soldier from bringing one of our own home." A ripple of agreement spread through the line. The young woman at the counter paled slightly, shifting her weight between her feet. Passengers began pulling out their phones, capturing what was quickly becoming a moment too significant to ignore. Carter didn't move. He had already decided he wasn't leaving until he got the answer he deserved. A tense silence settled over the airport terminal. Colonel David Carter remained motionless, his jaw clenched as he studied the supervisor's stiff posture. Around him, the energy in the room had shifted. The passengers in line were no longer just waiting for their flights. They were watching, listening, and beginning to understand that something wasn't right. The Marine who had spoken up stepped forward, his boots hitting the tile floor with deliberate weight. He was an older man, his face lined with experience, the years of service etched into his posture. His USMC cap was worn, but the authority in his voice was undeniable. "Son," he said, his voice steady, "I asked you a question. What's the real reason this officer isn't being allowed on his flight?" The supervisor hesitated. He had likely dealt with difficult customers before, but this wasn't a standard complaint about baggage fees or delays. This was something else entirely, and he knew he was losing control of the situation. "It's just a protocol issue," the man repeated, though his voice wavered slightly now under the weight of the attention pressing in on him. The Marine let out a sharp breath, crossing his arms. "Yeah? Funny thing about protocols, I've been through plenty of them, and not one of them has ever stopped a soldier from escorting a fallen brother home." A murmur spread through the terminal. More people began to take notice. A woman in a denim jacket shook her head, muttering to her husband. A young man in a hoodie pulled out his phone and started typing rapidly. The quiet hum of the airport had turned into something else, something charged, something dangerous for the airline. Carter stayed silent, but inside he was taking in every reaction. He had been in situations before where power tried to hide behind vague words, where people with just enough authority expected compliance without question. But the moment was slipping away from them now, spiraling into something they hadn't anticipated. The young woman behind the counter shifted nervously, her eyes darting toward the supervisor as if silently pleading for direction. He wasn't answering her. He wasn't answering anyone. And that was when the first camera went up. A woman standing near the windows lifted her phone, her expression a mix of disbelief and determination. The screen was already recording, the red dot blinking as she focused the lens on Carter and the airline staff. "I'm live right now," she said, her voice carrying through the terminal. "People need to see this." That was the spark. Within seconds, others followed suit. Phones rose in unison, passengers whispering to one another as they started capturing the moment. A man near the check-in counter murmured, "This isn't right," shaking his head as he hit the record button. The airline staff could feel it. The young agent behind the counter looked as if she wanted to disappear. The supervisor's face tightened, his gaze flicking toward the cameras. He had been hoping this situation would dissolve quietly. Now it was spreading, slipping further from his control with every passing second. Carter remained impassive, standing tall, his military uniform pristine despite the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He didn't need to say anything. The people were doing that for him. "This man is literally escorting a fallen soldier," a passenger near the front of the line said, his voice incredulous. "And they won't let him fly?" Another woman, further back, frowned. "Hey, excuse me," she called toward the counter, waving her hand. "Can someone explain why this is happening?" More voices joined in. Some were filled with outrage, others confusion. But the energy had fully shifted now. The airline staff weren't just denying one man a flight anymore. They were facing an entire terminal of people demanding answers. And then, from somewhere in the back, a voice muttered, "It's already trending." Carter didn't move, but the words settled over the room like a final confirmation of what was happening. He had seen how quickly information could spread, how a single moment could ignite something far bigger than itself. And now, the story was out. The supervisor seemed to realize it too. His face paled slightly as he turned to one of the agents behind the counter, whispering something urgently. But it was too late. The older Marine let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You boys really messed up," he muttered. Then the airport loudspeaker crackled to life. "Attention passengers, due to unforeseen circumstances, Flight 237 to Phoenix will be delayed. We apologize for any inconvenience." A few groans rippled through the crowd, but most people weren't concerned with the delay. Their focus remained fixed on Carter, on the staff, on the phones that continued recording every moment. Somewhere near the terminal windows, a young woman gasped. "He's on Twitter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned her screen toward those around her, and people leaned in. A tweet, written in bold capital letters, filled the display. "They just denied a black U.S. Army colonel his flight while escorting a fallen soldier's remains. This is how we treat our heroes? Let him fly." Below it, the numbers were climbing. Retweets, comments, likes, and then another notification. A verified account, a veteran advocacy group, had shared the story. "We are aware of the disgraceful incident happening at airport name. Our soldiers deserve better. Expect action." The murmurs in the crowd turned into something sharper. People weren't just spectators anymore. They were participants in something much bigger than a delayed flight. Carter remained silent, his gaze steady. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't celebrating. Because this wasn't about him. It was about Private First Class Jason Reynolds, the young soldier waiting to be escorted home. And this mission was still incomplete. The airport terminal, once a place of mindless routines and passing travelers, had transformed into something else entirely. The murmur of passengers checking in and shuffling through security had faded into a low, charged hum. People were no longer just waiting for flights, they were waiting for answers, and the world was watching. Within minutes, the situation had exploded across social media. The initial video, a young woman's trembling voice, narrating the injustice of a decorated Army colonel being denied his flight while escorting a fallen soldier, had already racked up thousands of views. Then came the retweets, the hashtags, the outrage spreading like wildfire across platforms. Let him fly. This is not okay. Carter stood motionless at the counter, his face unreadable, but he could feel the weight of the moment pressing against him. He wasn't unfamiliar with pressure, with situations where the stakes were far higher than a missed flight. But this was different. This wasn't war. This was bureaucracy. And it was happening in the one place where no soldier should ever have to fight for dignity home. The older Marine beside him let out a low whistle, shaking his head as he scrolled through his phone. "Colonel," he muttered under his breath, turning the screen toward him. "You're viral." Carter barely glanced at it, his expression steady. He didn't need to see the numbers climbing in real time. He already knew what it meant. Further down the terminal, passengers who had been recording were now glued to their screens, watching the reactions flood in. A businessman in a navy suit leaned against a pillar, shaking his head as he read through the comments. "Unbelievable. Is this really how we treat our military?" A woman near the coffee stand clutched her purse tightly, glancing at the airline counter with something between sympathy and disgust. "This is shameful. Someone fix this now." The supervisor, still standing behind the counter, had finally begun to realize that this was no longer just an internal issue to manage. His jaw was tight, his eyes darting between the agents and the growing crowd of restless onlookers. He tapped on his earpiece, whispering something urgently, damage control. But it was too late for that. The airline had already lost control of the story. The first news outlet picked it up within 15 minutes. A breaking news banner flashed across a screen in the terminal. U.S. Army colonel denied flight while escorting fallen soldier. Below it, footage from the terminal played. The grainy but unmistakable image of Carter, standing at the counter, his military uniform crisp against the dull backdrop of airline employees scrambling for an explanation. Passengers gasped as the screen updated with live comments scrolling underneath the broadcast. "I just saw this on Twitter. This is disgusting. This airline is done. Boycott them. Whoever made this decision should be fired on the spot." The agent at the counter shrank behind her computer screen. The supervisor wiped a hand down his face. The weight of what they had done was settling in, pressing against them as the outrage grew. And then, as if to confirm their worst fears, a second news segment began to air. A well-known journalist had retweeted the video, tagging the airline directly. "Explain yourselves, now." At that moment, a young airport employee rushed toward the counter, her eyes wide as she clutched a tablet. "Sir," she whispered to the supervisor, showing him the screen. "It's on CNN now." His face drained of color. Carter remained still, hands clasped behind his back, watching but not intervening. The battle had already moved beyond him. This was no longer about one soldier being denied a flight. This was about every soldier who had ever been dismissed, every moment of silent disrespect that had been tolerated. And now it had a spotlight. The supervisor took a step back, exhaling sharply as he turned toward one of the agents. "Find out who approved this," he ordered, his voice strained. "Now." The agent hesitated. "Sir, we." "Now." The shift in power was unmistakable. Passengers whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others gripping their phones as they continued to document every second. A mother, holding her child on her hip, muttered to her husband, "They thought they could get away with this." The older Marine folded his arms. They didn't count on people paying attention. And then, as if on cue, another major blow landed. The airline's official Twitter account, which had remained silent since the incident began, finally posted a response. But instead of calming the situation, it only made things worse. "We are aware of the situation involving an Army officer at airport name. We are looking into it." A single comment underneath the post summed up the public sentiment perfectly. Looking into it, too late, fix it. More backlash, more fury. A prominent veteran advocacy group issued a statement within minutes. "This is unacceptable. We stand with Colonel Carter. Our military should never be treated this way." Another organization chimed in. "We are demanding accountability. Expect action." By now, news anchors were discussing it live on air, and the CEO of the airline was being flooded with interview requests. The walls were closing in. Carter could see it in the way the supervisor's shoulders stiffened, in the way the airline employees whispered among themselves, in the way their once assured demeanor had crumbled into visible panic. This wasn't just a problem anymore. It was a crisis. And at the heart of it stood a single, unshaken truth. This should never have happened in the first place. The airport was in chaos. Airline executives scrambled behind closed doors, PR teams drafted emergency statements, and supervisors whispered into earpieces, desperately trying to find a way out of the situation that had spiraled beyond their control. But no amount of corporate maneuvering could undo what had already happened. The internet had seen it, the news was broadcasting it, and now, far more dangerous for them, the military had gotten involved. Colonel David Carter remained composed, standing tall in his uniform as the weight of public scrutiny bore down on the airline staff. His mission had never been about making headlines. His only goal was to ensure that Private First Class Jason Reynolds made it home. But now, this was bigger than him. This was about every service member who had ever been disrespected, every soldier whose sacrifice had been ignored by those who took their freedoms for granted. Then, the atmosphere in the terminal shifted again. A new presence entered the scene, one that made even the most arrogant airline executives stiffen. Through the terminal doors walked Major Thomas Beckett, his posture unmistakable, his steps carrying the authority of someone who had been sent for a purpose. The noise in the room seemed to dull as passengers noticed the crisp military uniform, the stern set of his jaw. This was no airport official coming to smooth things over. This was the U.S. Army stepping in. He didn't pause at the check-in counter. He didn't need to. He made his way directly to Colonel Carter, extended a firm hand, and spoke in a voice that left no room for debate. "Colonel, I'm Major Beckett, Department of the Army. We've been informed of the situation." Carter met his gaze, gripping his hand in a firm shake. "Major." Beckett turned to the airline supervisor, his expression unreadable. "This situation is no longer yours to handle," he said, his voice calm but carrying enough weight to silence the growing murmurs around them. "Colonel Carter and Private Reynolds will not be flying commercial. The Pentagon has arranged for a private military flight." A ripple went through the crowd. The airline staff froze, and for a moment the only sound was the distant hum of airport announcements. The passengers, many of whom had been watching the unfolding disaster with outrage, now saw something they hadn't expected: direct intervention from the highest levels of the military. The airline supervisor, visibly uncomfortable, attempted to recover. "Major, we were just about to." Beckett cut him off with a pointed glance. "No, you weren't." He turned back to Carter. "Your transport is waiting, Colonel." Carter gave a brief nod. He hadn't asked for any of this, but he wasn't about to reject the support now that it had arrived. His mission was still the same: to get Private Reynolds home with the honor he deserved. But the consequences for the airline weren't over. A woman in the crowd, a veteran herself, crossed her arms. "So now that the Army's here, they magically have a flight?" she said, loud enough for others to hear. "Funny how that works." The Marine who had spoken up earlier shook his head. "They got caught. That's the only reason they're backpedaling." More passengers murmured in agreement. This wasn't just about one mistake, it was about a system that had failed a soldier when it should have honored him. Beckett wasn't finished. He glanced at the airline representative, his expression turning cold. "Expect formal action," he stated plainly. "We will be reviewing this incident at the highest level." The supervisor swallowed hard. He knew what that meant. Investigations, policy reviews, the kind of scrutiny no airline wanted on their record. Meanwhile, the crowd had begun to shift, not just watching, but actively participating in the conversation. Phones were still recording. Reporters were rushing to update their broadcasts. Then, as if to cement the moment further, a notification pinged across social media. A statement from the Secretary of Defense. "We are aware of the unacceptable treatment of Colonel Carter while escorting Private Reynolds. Our military deserves unwavering respect. We are taking this matter seriously." That was it. The final blow. The airline had tried to bury the problem, tried to ignore it, but now the highest levels of government were watching. The backlash wasn't stopping, it was only growing. Major Beckett turned back to Carter. "Let's get you where you need to be, Colonel." Carter adjusted his uniform, nodded once, and walked toward the exit with Beckett at his side. The crowd parted for them, some saluting, others nodding in silent respect. And just like that, the mission continued. But for the airline, this was only the beginning of their reckoning. The fallout from the incident was swift and unforgiving. Within hours of Colonel Carter's departure, the story had taken on a life of its own. News outlets scrambled to cover the scandal, running headline after headline detailing how a decorated U.S. Army colonel had been denied a flight while escorting a fallen soldier. Social media had erupted, turning outrage into a wildfire that spread across the internet. The airline, once confident that they could control the situation with vague corporate statements and hollow apologies, was now drowning in a wave of public fury. Hashtags calling for boycotts trended worldwide. Veterans organizations released scathing statements condemning the airline's treatment of a service member on official duty. Politicians, desperate to align themselves with the anger of their constituents, demanded investigations into airline policies and their treatment of military personnel. But the real damage was not just in words, it was in action. Customers began canceling their flights en masse. Military families, service members, and supporters flooded the airline's customer service lines, demanding refunds, refusing to fly with a company that had disrespected a soldier's final journey. Travel agencies reported a significant drop in bookings with the airline. Investors, sensing the PR disaster unfolding, started pulling out. Within 48 hours, the company's stock price had taken a noticeable hit. The airline's leadership scrambled to salvage the situation. Executives met behind closed doors. Crisis managers worked around the clock to craft a response that could stop the bleeding. But no matter what they tried, the damage had already been done. No carefully worded press release could erase the videos that had already circulated, showing Colonel Carter standing at the counter, facing denial after denial, while a crowd of civilians watched in growing disbelief. Their first attempt at damage control, a short, impersonal statement expressing regret for any inconvenience caused, only made things worse. The backlash intensified. Veterans groups called for protests. High-profile figures within the military community publicly announced that they would no longer fly with the airline. Then came the lawsuits. A coalition of advocacy organizations filed formal complaints, citing discrimination and a failure to uphold service member protections. Legal analysts debated the case on television, dissecting the airline's policies, questioning how a mistake like this could happen in the first place. Under immense pressure, the airline CEO finally stepped in, making a rare public appearance to deliver a more formal apology. He stood in front of the cameras, his expression somber, his tone measured, as he assured the public that steps were being taken to review internal policies and ensure that such incidents never happen again. But it was too little, too late. People weren't looking for empty reassurances. They were looking for accountability. The employees responsible for denying Colonel Carter were placed on administrative leave, but that did little to appease the anger of those who had witnessed the injustice firsthand. To the public, this wasn't just about a flight. It was about respect, about the treatment of those who had given everything for their country, and the world had seen it all unfold. The airline, once an untouchable giant in the industry, now faced its worst crisis yet. As stocks continued to drop, as their brand was dragged through the mud, one truth became clear: disrespecting those who serve had consequences. And this time, no corporate spin could make it go away. Respect should never be conditional. It should not take public outrage, viral videos, or mass boycotts for people to be treated with dignity, especially those who have dedicated their lives to serving others. Colonel Carter didn't demand special treatment. He wasn't looking for recognition. He was simply carrying out his duty, honoring a promise made to a fallen soldier. And yet, he was met with resistance, with excuses, with an unspoken but undeniable bias that tried to stand in his way. But what this story proves is that silence is never the answer. The moment people spoke up, the moment strangers at the airport refused to look away, the tide began to turn. When the voices of everyday citizens, veterans, and supporters grew louder than corporate indifference, justice was no longer optional. It became inevitable. This is more than just one incident. It is a reminder that injustice exists in the small moments, in the policies left unquestioned, in the treatment we allow to go unchallenged. The next time you witness something wrong, ask yourself, will you speak up? Or will you let it happen? Because real change begins when ordinary people refuse to stay silent. If you believe in standing up for what's right, comment 1 below. If you think there's still work to be done, comment 2. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to make sure stories like this are never forgotten. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next powerful story.